The room is already awake when you enter it, even though no one has claimed the floor yet. Coats are draped over chair backs in a way that suggests they might be needed again soon. Glasses sit half full on narrow tables, condensation gathering and sliding down in thin lines. A few people stand near the windows, facing outward as if the street below deserves their full attention, though their eyes keep returning to the room, checking for movement behind them. Others sit with their phones face down, hands resting loosely nearby, signaling availability without asking for it. No one looks hurried. No one looks settled either. It is a waiting posture shared by the entire space. You take a seat where you can see most of them. Nothing announces itself. No one introduces an agenda. Still, something is moving. Attention drifts from posture to posture, from silence to silence, measuring without admitting it is doing so. Small adjustments register more clearly than words ever could. This is how influence tends to begin. Not with intention made visible, but with presence that settles before anyone thinks to name it. Power at this stage has no need to speak. It watches. It allows the atmosphere to organize itself around what is left unsaid, trusting that people will reveal more than they mean to. Across the room, someone laughs a fraction too early, then reins it in as if deciding whether the sound belonged there. Another person leans forward during a pause, elbows briefly on knees, then eases back again when no one looks their way. These movements are small, almost forgettable, yet they carry more information than confident speech ever could. People show their desires most clearly when they believe nothing important is happening. Seduction lives here in this prelude. Not as romance alone and not as performance, but as the quiet shaping of interest. It is the ability to draw attention without reaching for it, to be felt without declaring yourself. Those who understand this do not hurry. They let others supply the meaning, and they do not interrupt that process once it begins. You notice how easily the mind fills empty space. A silence becomes intentional. A stillness becomes confidence. The absence of explanation invites interpretation, and interpretation binds more tightly than instruction ever could. People begin responding not to what is offered, but to what they imagine might be. Some figures in the room seem to carry themselves differently. They are not necessarily the most striking or the most animated. They speak briefly, then stop, allowing their words to settle rather than chasing them with clarification. When they listen, they do not nod too quickly or rush to reassure. Their attention feels deliberate, as if it cost them something to offer it. Others begin to angle toward them without realizing they are doing so. What draws attention is rarely effort. It is containment. The sense that something is being held back, not out of fear but out of choice. This restraint creates shape. It gives interest somewhere to land. You think of moments from your own life when someone's absence lingered longer than another person's presence. A message that arrived later than expected. A conversation that ended one thought early. A look that acknowledged without claiming. These were not dramatic acts, yet they stayed with you, replaying themselves without permission, gaining weight with time. What pulls people in is suggestion. A pause that invites curiosity. A response that does not rush to satisfy it. The seducer understands that desire sharpens when it is not fully answered, and they trust this process enough not to interfere with it. Around you, the room begins to fill with low conversation. Voices overlap, then separate again. Laughter appears and fades. Still, the undercurrent remains. Influence is already circulating, quiet and patient, attaching itself to those who know how to wait without withdrawing. You realize, without fully articulating it, that seduction does not begin with action. It begins with restraint. With the discipline to hold your position long enough for others to notice that you are not moving simply because they expect you to. This is the foundation being laid. Not a collection of tricks, not a performance to be maintained, but a way of standing in the world. Calm. Attentive. Willing to let interest find you before you decide what to do with it. Something is already happening, and it does not require you to rush toward it. As the evening loosens, the room begins to rearrange itself without discussion. People drift into smaller clusters, not by invitation but by instinct, drawn together by a shared pause or a glance that lingered a moment longer than expected. Conversations thin then deepen. Someone steps away mid-sentence, not abruptly, just early enough to leave a question hovering where an answer might have been. Another person stays quiet longer than seems polite, listening with an attention that feels unhurried, almost selective. You begin to notice where gravity settles. It is not always where voices rise. Often it gathers at the edges, around those who stand close enough to be included but distant enough to remain undefined. They are not competing for space. They are letting space bend toward them. Seduction advances through these adjustments. It depends less on what is offered than on what is withheld. A story begins, then pauses before its point arrives. A reaction is delayed, not from uncertainty but from choice. People lean in without realizing they have done so, supplying energy to gaps that were never explicitly offered. The book's movement here is patient. It shows how attraction grows when the mind is allowed to participate. When answers arrive too quickly, curiosity shuts down. When explanations remain incomplete, imagination steps forward, supplying detail, motive, and meaning. What people imagine often binds them more tightly than what they are given. You see how often others undo themselves by rushing. They explain what does not require explanation. They clarify what was already understood. They fill silence out of habit, not necessity. In doing so, they flatten the texture of the moment, leaving nothing for attention to rest on. Those who understand seduction resist this impulse. They let pauses stand without defending them. They allow responses to arrive at their own pace. When they speak, their words feel chosen rather than spilled, and this selectivity gives those words weight. There is a quiet discipline in knowing when to exit. Leaving a conversation while it still carries warmth, rather than waiting for it to cool. Ending a moment on an upward curve instead of allowing it to taper into familiarity. These choices feel courteous, even incidental, yet they shape memory far more reliably than extended presence ever could. The book returns to rhythm again and again. Approach followed by retreat. Familiarity followed by space. When everything is offered at once, interest exhausts itself. When things are revealed in sequence, attention remains alert, responsive, awake. You notice how people recall certain interactions later, detached from context. A tone resurfaces. A fragment of a sentence returns. The exchange continues internally, long after the room has emptied. Seduction does its most durable work after the moment has passed. Listening becomes central here, but not the kind that waits for its turn. This listening absorbs without rushing to respond. It allows the speaker to hear themselves more clearly, sometimes for the first time. People often mistake this for deep understanding, even intimacy, because it offers something rare, unpressured attention. Yet the seducer does not disappear into the other person's world. Agreement is not automatic. Differences are allowed to remain visible. Too much mirroring collapses tension. A slight distinction keeps the exchange alive, giving it shape. As the night moves on, you see moments where restraint falters. Someone presses a point too hard. Someone lingers after interest has begun to fade. The shift is subtle, almost invisible, but it alters the air. Attention loosens. Eyes wander. The sense of possibility thins. These moments are not failures so much as reminders. Seduction is fragile when forced. It depends on sensitivity to timing, to signals that indicate when to advance and when to hold back. Awareness, not intention, makes the difference. When done well, it feels effortless. When misjudged, it feels heavy. The distinction is felt immediately, even if it is not articulated. By the time people begin to leave, coats pulled back on, conversations closing with varying degrees of warmth, you notice how some presences linger more than others. Not because they did more, but because they left something unfinished. A thought. A possibility. A sense that the exchange could have gone further, if only time had allowed it. This is how seduction continues its work. Not through insistence but through absence. Not through clarity but through suggestion. It follows people home quietly, resurfacing later when the noise of the room has finally fallen away. Morning arrives without ceremony. Light slides across familiar surfaces, catching on the edge of a table, the curve of a doorway, the quiet accumulation of objects that no longer ask for attention. You move through small, habitual motions, and beneath them, fragments of the night before remain. A pause in a conversation resurfaces. A look that seemed unremarkable at the time returns with greater clarity. Seduction at this point reveals its longer reach. It is no longer confined to a single exchange. It stretches across time, shaping memory, deciding what lingers and what dissolves. The book turns toward this continuity, toward the way desire often grows not through intensity, but through what remains unfinished between moments. Attention shifts inward now, toward the emotional landscape people carry quietly. Most do not articulate what they want most. Instead, they circle it. They repeat the same stories, return to the same disappointments, emphasize the same hopes. They are not asking for solutions. They are waiting to be noticed at the right level. You begin to recognize these patterns as they appear. The person who frequently mentions feeling overlooked but laughs when saying it. The one who measures each exchange carefully, searching for reassurance without naming the need. The one who becomes animated only when routine is disrupted. Desire announces itself through repetition long before it does through confession. Seduction begins when you respond to these currents rather than to the surface of conversation. This response is rarely explicit. It shows up in tone, in what you choose to acknowledge and what you allow to pass without comment. When someone feels met where they did not expect to be seen, the effect is often subtle but immediate. Something eases. Attention settles. The book is careful here. It does not suggest imitation or performance. It emphasizes resonance. The seducer does not reshape themselves to match another's longing. Instead, they allow certain aspects of themselves to come forward naturally, aligning with the moment without losing coherence. The self remains intact but responsive. You see this play out in ordinary interactions. A comment that recognizes effort rather than outcome. A question that opens space instead of closing it. A response that shifts the emotional direction slightly, inviting depth without demanding it. These gestures are modest, yet they alter how the interaction unfolds. Once interest has been stirred, restraint becomes even more critical. The temptation is to secure it, to clarify intentions, to ensure the connection does not slip away. The book cautions against this impulse. Desire needs uncertainty to remain alive. When everything is defined too quickly, curiosity loses its footing. Ambiguity is allowed to remain. Intentions are felt rather than declared. The seducer tolerates incompleteness, understanding that not every moment requires resolution. This tolerance keeps attention engaged without creating anxiety. Rhythm reasserts itself as a guiding force. Lightness followed by gravity. Closeness followed by space. Predictability dulls attention. Variation sharpens it. Change is introduced gently, never enough to destabilize, but enough to prevent stagnation. Self-command becomes visible here. Emotional reactions still arise, but they are noticed before they are expressed. Impulses are acknowledged without immediate obedience. This pause creates choice, and choice produces behavior that feels composed rather than reactive. The book does not present this as perfection. Misjudgments occur. Signals are misread. Timing falters. What matters is recovery. Returning to composure restores balance more effectively than explanation or justification ever could. As the day unfolds, interactions accumulate. A brief exchange while waiting. A familiar conversation that feels unexpectedly charged. You notice how slight shifts in pacing and attention change what others offer in return. They linger a moment longer. They speak with less caution. They reveal more without being asked. What becomes clear is that seduction, sustained, is less about creating desire and more about giving it room. It respects autonomy. It invites rather than insists. It allows people to approach at their own speed without pressure to arrive. By evening, something has recalibrated. There is less urgency in how you move. Less focus on outcome. More attention to process. You are not trying to be compelling. You are simply present, and presence begins to shape the exchange on its own. What remains is not a method but a way of seeing. Desire moving quietly through everyday life, shaping behavior softly, waiting for those who know how to notice without rushing to interfere. Evening returns with a slower weight than before. Doors close behind people as they step back into familiar spaces. Shoes are set aside without thought. Lights come on one room at a time, filling corners gradually rather than all at once. What remains from the day is not the sequence of events, but the impressions they left behind. Certain interactions follow people into quiet. Others fade as soon as the noise does. Here, the book turns its attention toward control of a different kind. Not control over others but command over one's own responses. Nothing unsettles attraction more quickly than emotional overflow. The urge to explain too much. The need to secure reassurance before it is offered. The subtle anxiety that shows itself through overpresence. These impulses often reveal more than words intend. Composure becomes central. Not coldness. Not distance. But containment. Feelings are felt fully, then shaped before being expressed. What reaches others is measured, deliberate, and therefore more resonant. People sense this regulation even if they cannot name it, and they often interpret it as depth. You notice how restraint alters the atmosphere of an interaction. When someone does not react immediately, space opens. Others step into that space, offering attention, curiosity, even vulnerability. Approval, when it is not automatic, becomes meaningful. This is not punishment or withholding. It is proportion. The book lingers on moments when seduction falters. An advance made before interest has had time to settle. A truth revealed before the ground is ready to receive it. Familiarity introduced too quickly, flattening what was still forming. These moments are not framed as errors of intent, but as misalignments of timing. Desire is sensitive to tempo, and when the rhythm is disrupted, the connection thins. Timing begins to feel almost physical. Each interaction carries its own pace, its own internal clock. Forcing movement feels like pushing against resistance you cannot see. The seducer listens for this tempo, adjusting rather than insisting. When timing is respected, the exchange feels natural. When it is ignored, it feels heavy. Power dynamics surface quietly here. Attention moves toward those who appear least urgent for it. Respect gathers around those who do not chase validation. Often, the person who seems to lead is responding to cues established earlier by someone who understood when to pause. You become aware of how people manage silence. Some rush to fill it, afraid it signals disconnection. Others allow it to rest, trusting that presence alone is sufficient. The latter draws focus without effort. Silence becomes a signal of confidence rather than absence. As the progression continues, the book explores how attraction sustains itself beyond its first spark. Novelty fades quickly if it is not replaced by depth. This depth does not arrive through intensity or confession, but through shared experience accumulated over time. Familiarity is layered carefully, not revealed all at once. A distinction sharpens between intimacy and exposure. Intimacy is selective. It grows through moments that feel earned. Exposure, when unrestrained, dissolves tension. The seducer learns what to offer and what to hold back, understanding that not everything needs to be shared to be felt. You sense a growing ease in this approach. There is less urgency to manage outcomes. Influence begins to feel collaborative rather than directive. People move closer not because they are guided, but because they feel understood without being cornered. Withdrawal becomes part of the vocabulary. Knowing when to step away preserves both dignity and desire. Staying too long, pressing for clarity, insisting on resolution can undo careful balance. Leaving while something remains unresolved allows the unresolved to keep working. Seduction here resembles stewardship. Attention is guided, not seized. Atmosphere is maintained with care. Moods are treated as fragile, contagious things that deserve respect rather than exploitation. As night deepens, you notice how these dynamics extend beyond intimacy. In negotiations, in leadership, in moments of disagreement. Wherever tone and timing shape response, the same principles apply. Seduction becomes a broader language of influence, spoken quietly. What settles in is a calm authority. Not dominance but assurance. When you are grounded in yourself, others feel it. They trust it without needing proof. They respond without knowing exactly why. The day closes but the process does not. It continues invisibly, refining how you listen, how you pause, how you let moments unfold instead of forcing them into definition. The next morning feels quieter, not because there is less happening but because you are listening differently. You notice how people test boundaries without naming the test. A question framed casually, then left open as if it could be taken back without consequence. An invitation offered lightly, paired with a tone that suggests there is no expectation attached. These gestures are small, almost polite, yet they carry weight. Each one asks without asking how much space exists between you. The book lingers here, in this middle terrain where attraction is present but not secure. It shows how easily momentum can be mistaken for certainty. Interest, once sparked, creates the illusion that it will sustain itself. Often it does not. Left unattended, it thins not because it was weak but because it was assumed. At this stage, seduction becomes less about initiating and more about preserving texture. The early shimmer gives way to something steadier. Reliability enters not as routine but as emotional coherence. Time spent with you begins to feel distinct, marked by a particular quality that does not replicate itself elsewhere. You begin to see how this quality is maintained. By keeping confidences without announcing loyalty. By showing up when it matters, then stepping back again rather than lingering for credit. By offering support without absorbing another person's weight as your own. These choices communicate strength without possession. Discernment sharpens. Not every response needs encouragement. Not every signal needs amplification. The book emphasizes selectivity, not as judgment but as clarity. Attention offered indiscriminately loses its meaning. Attention offered with care gains density. This selectivity is rarely explained. It is felt. Time is given fully but not endlessly. Warmth is present but not unconditional. Boundaries exist as a quiet perimeter rather than a spoken rule. Others sense where they are without being told. Vulnerability enters carefully here. Not as release. Not as confession. But as precision. Something meaningful is shared at the moment it can be received. The timing carries as much importance as the content. Shared too early, it overwhelms. Shared too late, it feels withheld. Shared at the right moment, it deepens connection without collapsing mystery. There is patience in this pacing. Emotional closeness is allowed to grow through experience rather than declaration. When uncertainty appears, it is not rushed away. Space is given for feeling to organize itself. Often this space strengthens attachment rather than threatening it. You notice how differently people behave when they do not feel pressed. Their speech slows. Their posture eases. They reveal themselves without prompting. The seducer's role becomes more receptive now, shaping atmosphere rather than directing exchange. Resistance is acknowledged without challenge. Not every hesitation is an invitation to persist. Knowing when to disengage is presented as a form of respect. Withdrawal, when done with composure, preserves dignity and often leaves a stronger impression than insistence would have. Seduction begins to resemble leadership here. Not command but influence rooted in trust. People follow because they want to, not because they are convinced. They feel valued without being claimed, supported without being managed. You reflect on how rare this experience is. How often interactions are driven by urgency, insecurity, or the need to secure standing. Against this backdrop, calm presence feels spacious. It offers relief without promising more than it can hold. The book remains observational. It does not instruct. It watches patterns repeat and allows their effects to become visible over time. Gradually, it becomes clear that seduction is less about action and more about temperament. As the day moves on, this temperament shows itself in ordinary moments. A conversation stretches without effort. A meeting feels focused rather than tense. A pause no longer signals discomfort. These shifts are subtle but they accumulate. By evening, something inside you has settled further. The urge to secure outcomes has softened. The need to be chosen has loosened. What remains is attentiveness, and with it, a confidence that does not ask to be noticed. Seduction here feels less like effort and more like alignment. A natural result of presence practiced with care, leaving others free to approach without pressure. Time begins to stretch in a way that feels almost generous. Days pass without calling attention to themselves, and within them, interactions settle into a rhythm that no longer needs constant adjustment. You notice how people begin to anticipate rather than react. They sense when you will arrive, when you will speak, when you will step back. This expectation is quiet, but it carries weight. The book turns here toward what happens after attraction has found its footing. Not the brightness of the beginning, but the steadier work that follows. Seduction, sustained, depends on care that does not announce itself as effort. Too much attention makes it visible. Too little allows it to fade. The balance is held through awareness rather than control. Anticipation becomes a central force. When moments are spaced well, people begin to look forward rather than simply respond. They replay what has already happened, sometimes without meaning to. They imagine what might come next without demanding that it arrive. This movement backward and forward keeps desire active without urgency. You notice how tone begins to lead more than words. A calm entrance subtly steadies a room. A measured departure leaves something unfinished without creating discomfort. Others adjust themselves to this rhythm without knowing why. Influence emerges not through direction, but through consistency that can be felt. The book spends time with tension here, not as a problem to solve, but as information to hold. There are moments when connection feels slightly strained, when something is misaligned or unspoken. Instead of rushing to repair these moments, the seducer allows them space. Emotion is acknowledged without being amplified. This restraint prevents small disruptions from becoming lasting fractures. Many instinctively rush toward reassurance, fearing that distance signals loss. Here, distance is treated differently. Space becomes a signal rather than a threat. When held with composure, absence often restores balance more effectively than explanation ever could. Used sparingly, it renews appreciation. Authenticity sharpens during this phase. Not as exposure but as coherence. What is said aligns with what is done. Promises are not implied where they cannot be kept. This consistency builds trust, and trust deepens attraction beyond surface interest. You see how people relax around this steadiness. They invest without needing guarantees. They speak more openly because they do not feel managed. Seduction begins to feel mutual, no longer a dynamic of pull and response, but a shared current that carries both sides. The book does not avoid endings. It acknowledges that not every connection is meant to last indefinitely. Knowing when a chapter has completed itself is part of mastery. Ending with composure preserves respect and often leaves a stronger impression than prolonging something past its vitality. There is no emphasis on finality, no dramatic closures, just a quiet recognition of timing. When something has run its course, letting it rest feels natural rather than forced. You grow more comfortable with incompleteness. Not every interaction needs resolution. Not every relationship needs definition. Some impressions gain strength precisely because they are left open, allowed to breathe. The ideas begin to circle back toward presence again. Seduction, fully integrated, becomes indistinguishable from how you carry yourself, how you manage attention, how you hold tension without demanding release. It is no longer something you perform. It is something that happens around you. You notice the shift most clearly in yourself. There is less urgency in your movements, less noise in your thoughts. Listening feels deeper because it is unhurried. Speaking feels lighter because it is no longer used to secure position. This way of being does not guarantee admiration or attachment. It does not promise permanence. What it creates is possibility. A space where attraction can arise naturally, shaped by respect rather than pressure. The book remains quiet here, trusting that the pattern is now visible. Seduction continues not as a strategy, but as a rhythm you recognize and move with, even when no one else is watching. There comes a moment when effort fades into posture. You do not mark it. You simply notice that you are no longer correcting yourself mid-thought or replaying conversations for hidden missteps. You wake, move, speak, and listen with a steadiness that no longer feels deliberate. What once required attention now expresses itself through pacing, through tone, through the ease with which you allow moments to arrive and pass. The book lingers in this long middle stretch, where seduction has stopped feeling like an act and begun to resemble character. People respond to you differently, though rarely in ways they articulate. Conversations settle faster. Disagreements soften before they sharpen. Invitations appear without preamble, as if the decision had been made quietly elsewhere, before anyone thought to mention it. Attention turns inward again, but without tension. Clarity of self becomes the anchor. When that clarity blurs, influence weakens. The book suggests returning often to stillness, not to refine technique, but to re-establish coherence. Attraction follows alignment more reliably than intention ever could. You notice how inner disorder reveals itself outwardly. A restless mind produces hurried speech. Uncertainty shows up as explanation that arrives too early. When you are settled, fewer words are needed. Silence begins to work on your behalf, not as withdrawal, but as presence that does not require reinforcement. There is a quiet reckoning with ego here. Early success can tempt excess. Admiration can invite testing, a desire to confirm reach or effect. The book treats this moment carefully, warning that when response becomes the goal, seduction collapses into performance. What once felt natural begins to feel strained, even brittle. True influence, as it is framed now, requires humility. Not diminishment, but proportion. Desire is shared ground, not a prize. People are not outcomes. They are participants in an exchange that only remains alive when both retain freedom of choice. This awareness sharpens ethical boundaries without hardening them. You become more attentive to impact, to whether your presence brings ease or pressure, to whether attraction opens space or narrows it. Mastery includes the ability to stop, to step back before momentum overrides care. The tone grows quieter. Earlier ideas return, altered by time. Mystery has become depth. Distance has become respect. Selectivity has become integrity. Nothing feels dramatic, yet everything feels intentional. You notice how little spectacle remains. There is no need to command a room. Often, the most compelling presence is the one that does not compete. It stands apart without isolating itself, confident enough to let attention arrive or drift away without chasing either. Days continue. Small moments accumulate. A relationship deepens without discussion. Attention dissolves without being named. These shifts happen not through decisive action, but through sustained tone, through consistency held across time. The book allows room for error. Signals are misread. Timing slips. What matters is recovery. Returning to composure restores balance more effectively than defense or justification ever could. Seduction, now fully integrated, becomes indistinguishable from how you manage desire itself. How you respect autonomy. How you hold uncertainty without rushing to resolve it. It is less about attracting many and more about engaging well. The narrative acknowledges change. Contexts shift. Seasons alter what draws people together. What once worked may no longer apply. Adaptability remains essential, guided now by discernment rather than experimentation. You sense the confidence of someone who no longer needs to prove appeal. The knowledge is present, available but not always used. Choice replaces compulsion. Influence becomes optional rather than necessary. The book does not close desire off. It places it within a larger rhythm. Attraction rises and falls. Connections form and release. What endures is the capacity to remain present through all of it, attentive without grasping, steady without force. This presence follows you forward. It does not announce itself. It leaves impressions that linger not because they were loud, but because they were held with care. At some point you stop keeping track of effect. Not because nothing is happening but because the need to measure it has softened. You notice this during an ordinary exchange, one that unfolds without effort or friction. The conversation moves where it wants to go. Listening feels as natural as speaking. When it ends, there is no sense of interruption, only completion even though nothing was resolved outright. The book settles into this register with patience. It suggests that seduction, once absorbed, becomes quieter even as it grows more reliable. The gestures grow smaller. The signals soften. What remains is a tone that others feel before they try to interpret it. They respond to it without needing to understand why. You begin to see how easily desire is distorted when it is treated as a problem to solve. People try to optimize connection, to manage outcomes, to secure certainty. In doing so, they flatten what should remain alive. The book returns again to atmosphere. How it feels to be near someone. How time seems to behave in their presence. These qualities resist force. They respond only to care. Patience now feels earned rather than imposed. Waiting no longer feels like delay. It feels like discernment. You allow situations to show their shape before responding, and often the right response arrives without strain, carried by the moment itself rather than constructed in advance. Absence takes on a different meaning here. It is no longer a tactic or a test. It is simply the result of a life that is full elsewhere. You are not always available because you are engaged, grounded, occupied by things that do not depend on reaction. This fullness gives your attention weight when it is offered. It feels chosen rather than assumed. People respond to this balance in subtle ways. They approach without urgency. They linger without clinging. The dynamic feels cleaner, less burdened by expectation. Attraction breathes because it is not being monitored too closely. Vulnerability deepens, but it remains proportionate. You share when sharing serves connection, not when it serves relief. What is revealed carries weight because it is timed, because it is not used to discharge feeling. This precision strengthens trust without overwhelming it. Power appears again but quietly. Not as dominance or command but as organization. Rooms settle when you enter them. Conversations find their pace. People seek your perspective without being prompted. This is not control. It is confidence communicated through consistency. You reflect on how trust accumulates, not through intensity but through reliability of tone, through showing up in the same emotional register, through responding rather than reacting. Over time, this steadiness becomes attractive in itself. A caution runs beneath these passages. When seduction is mistaken for entitlement, it corrodes. Expectation replaces invitation. Curiosity hardens into assumption. The book underscores the importance of remaining genuinely interested in others rather than assuming access to them. Desire survives only where choice is respected. As interactions mature, the need to impress continues to fade. You are less concerned with how moments are perceived and more attentive to how they unfold. This attentiveness creates room for surprise, for connection that feels mutual rather than arranged. The tone grows almost meditative. Influence no longer feels like effort. Presence carries weight because it is unencumbered by urgency. Silence communicates as much as speech ever did, sometimes more. Endings become easier to recognize. When a connection completes itself, you allow it to close without grasping. Completion feels coherent rather than abrupt. Something has finished its movement and that is enough. This is not detachment. It is respect. For yourself. For others. For the rhythms that govern attention and desire. Holding on too tightly distorts those rhythms. Letting go restores them. As days continue, this way of being integrates further. It shapes how you enter rooms, how you listen to disagreement, how you leave conversations unfinished without discomfort. You trust space now. You allow it to do its work. Seduction, in this light, appears less as pursuit and more as consequence. A result of steadiness, awareness, and restraint practiced over time. It follows naturally when you are aligned with yourself and attentive to others. The book continues toward its close without summing up, without drawing lines under its insights. It leaves you inside the ongoing movement of life, where desire ebbs and flows, and where influence remains most potent when it is lightly held. A steadiness settles that feels less like accomplishment and more like return. You recognize it in how you receive attention now. You no longer lean toward it and you no longer brace against it. You allow it to arrive, to rest briefly, to pass on if it needs to. Nothing tightens around it. Nothing is held too tightly. The book lingers here, examining how seduction changes its relationship with time. In the beginning, everything feels urgent because nothing feels secure. Each moment seems to matter disproportionately. Later, urgency gives way to calibration. You begin to recognize cycles instead of isolated moments. Interest rises, softens, returns. Distance appears, then resolves. You stop mistaking fluctuation for loss. This understanding reshapes how you meet doubt, both your own and that of others. When uncertainty surfaces, you do not rush to smooth it away. You let it speak. Often, it carries information you would miss if you hurried past it. It reveals where attachment is forming, where fear has entered, where something matters enough to create tension. Responding too quickly would flatten that signal. You notice how people reveal themselves most clearly when they believe something is slipping. A sudden eagerness where there was calm before. A guarded silence that does not match the words being spoken. A shift in tone that signals more than it explains. These changes are not problems to solve. They are moments to hold with attention rather than intervention. Composure deepens into spaciousness. When you remain settled, others have room to adjust themselves. They do not feel managed. They do not feel corrected. They feel met. This distinction is quiet, but it alters the entire exchange. Respect for individuality sharpens here. Mature seduction does not seek to reshape others. It allows them to remain intact while still feeling drawn closer. When someone senses they do not have to surrender themselves to stay connected, attachment strengthens without resistance. This respect shows itself in small choices. You allow disagreement to exist without correcting it. You listen without rushing to align. You let differences remain visible without turning them into distance. This ease with contrast signals security, and security attracts without asking. The book touches briefly on rivalry and envy, emotions that surface when attention becomes visible. These are not treated as threats but as reflections of value. How you respond matters. Defensiveness sharpens tension. Indifference dismisses it too quickly. Calm acknowledgement diffuses it, allowing things to settle back into proportion. You learn to hold your position without explanation. To neither conceal nor display the attention you receive. This neutrality communicates confidence more clearly than assertion ever could. It removes the need to prove or protect. Seduction now feels ambient. It is no longer something you initiate deliberately. It emerges around you. Conversations lengthen or shorten on their own. People linger where they feel unhurried. They speak more honestly when they sense they are not being evaluated. The book does not pretend this state is effortless. Presence requires energy. Awareness needs replenishment. There are times when withdrawal is not strategic but necessary. Rest becomes part of maintenance, not retreat but restoration. You recognize the importance of tending to a life beyond influence. Solitude, creative work, physical rhythm. These anchor you. When your life feels full, attraction becomes a complement rather than a compensation, something that adds rather than fills a gap. There is an understated satisfaction in this balance. You are no longer scanning for response. You are engaged in what you are doing and others join when it aligns for them. Connection feels lighter when it is not carrying the weight of need. The book's voice grows quieter as it approaches its final ground. It speaks of what remains after encounters fade. How people remember feeling in your presence. Whether they felt rushed or respected. Seen or measured. Calm or unsettled. These impressions endure longer than gestures. They shape how people return, or how they carry you forward when you are no longer present. Seduction here becomes imprint rather than event. You find yourself more attentive to endings. How conversations close. How pauses are handled. How you leave a room. Often, the final moments shape memory more strongly than the beginning ever did. Days continue with fewer sharp edges. Less friction. More flow. Not because everything goes smoothly but because you are no longer forcing direction. You allow the current to reveal itself before choosing how to move within it. The pattern is clear now. Seduction has become attentiveness practiced over time. Restraint held without tension. Presence offered without demand. It no longer announces itself because it no longer needs to. The pace of things widens again. Not because there is less to attend to, but because attention itself has grown steadier. Situations no longer feel compressed. You notice how little needs correction now. Most moments reveal their shape quickly, and you meet them without friction, adjusting with ease rather than effort. The book enters its final movement by returning to where everything began. with awareness, with how you stand inside a moment before you act. Seduction, it becomes clear, was never something added to life. It was something clarified. A way of relating that surfaced once distraction and urgency fell away. There is careful reflection here on power. Influence once felt invites misuse. The temptation to test it, to confirm it, to push against its limits just to see how far it reaches. The book treats this moment with restraint, suggesting that attraction distorted by ego empties itself quickly. What remains after that is control without connection, movement without meaning. Responsibility sharpens perception rather than dulling it. You listen more closely for hesitation. You sense when interest carries vitality and when it begins to feel pressured. The difference is subtle but unmistakable. One invites continuation. The other asks for pause. Learning to respect that signal becomes a form of quiet integrity. The book draws a clear distinction between being wanted and being valued. Seduction can awaken desire, but only consistency sustains respect. When actions align with words, when presence does not fluctuate to manage response, attraction matures into something steadier, something that does not need constant reinforcement. Solitude finds its place here, not as withdrawal but as grounding. Those who are at ease alone do not cling to attention. They offer it freely and receive it without fear. This ease changes every interaction. Silence no longer threatens connection. It becomes part of it, a shared space rather than a gap to be filled. You notice how conversations breathe differently now. Pauses feel natural instead of awkward. Words arrive when they are needed and remain absent when they are not. This rhythm allows others to settle into themselves, to speak from a place that feels less guarded, less performative. As the ideas approach their close, seduction becomes almost indistinguishable from grace. Not elegance or polish but consideration. Knowing when to step forward. Knowing when to wait. Knowing when to step aside entirely without resentment or regret. The book does not promise permanence. Contexts shift. People change. What draws one season may not draw the next. What endures is adaptability without desperation. The ability to meet each new moment with the same attentiveness that once transformed uncertainty into attraction. You sense how this orientation extends beyond intimacy, into leadership, collaboration, disagreement. Anywhere people respond to tone, timing, and presence, these principles apply. Seduction becomes a broader skill of navigating human dynamics with care rather than force. There is a quiet confidence in this realization. You no longer need to hold every connection. You no longer need to maximize every response. What aligns will remain long enough to matter. What does not can be released without bitterness or self-reproach. The movement returns gently to the beginning. To the room where nothing obvious was happening, and yet everything had already started. You understand now that this is where seduction always lives. In ordinary moments. In transitions. In the space between intention and action. You carry this forward not as instruction but as orientation. A way of meeting the world that allows desire to arise naturally, shaped by presence rather than pressure, guided by awareness rather than need. Nothing concludes with emphasis. There is no final declaration, no lesson underlined. Only continuity. The same quiet patterns unfolding wherever people notice one another, hesitate, approach, and choose. Seduction remains there, patient and precise, in how you attend to what is already happening.